Today was the final day of the preliminary stage of the FTX Crypto Cup, and I'm going to show you a dramatic last round encounter between Magnus Carlsen and Teimour Radjabov. This was absolutely nerve-jangling. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and do subscribe, and do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon, links down there. Right, here we go. Carlsen with the white pieces. Now his poor form continued, and going into this last round game, he couldn't be certain that a draw would take him through. He had to play for a win. Now he did have the white pieces, but he was playing Radjabov, who is a very tough customer in any form of chess, but he's quite a rapid play specialist. Now Radjabov looks like he might want either a Kalashnikov or a Sveshnikov, both of those openings he's played. Carlsen declines, keeps his options open, still might play d4, but he also might go for bishop b5. For example, if knight f6, then bishop b5. We've seen recently a game with that continuation. It can be very tricky. But e5 from Radjabov, so that's a principal move, basically just clamping white in the centre, kind of move that Magnus likes to make actually. So preventing d4, but it does allow this bishop to sit itself on a very nice diagonal. Bishop e7, both sides developing, and knight d5. These kind of systems with this pawn chain c2, d3, e4, Carlsen likes very much. You'll recall that he gets this a lot from the Spanish, but also the Italian as well, the gioco piano. And in a sense, we have, with this particular pawn structure, although it started out as a Sicilian, we've actually transposed into a kind of Spanish gioco piano. Very similar pawn structure. So there's a bit of a fight going on for this beautiful d5 square, but black can contest that. So he might want to play b5. Carlsen shuts that down. Now knight takes and bishop f6, so that prepares to spin the knight round here. Rooks into the middle and bishop d2. So Carlsen is just looking to play b4. In principle, you know, I think he would have been very happy to, I think, get this position out of the opening where strategy dominates. There's also, actually, now that I see this pawn structure, it reminds me of a fantastic positional game that Carlsen played against Ariantari, defeated him beautifully. I think that arose out of a Spanish. But yeah, similar pawn structure basically. So the knight hits the bishop, which retreats. And knight g6 spins round to the king side. Looks reasonable. You never know when that knight might be able to hop in here. And now Carlsen begins his play on the queen side. That could be exchanged off. But b6 from Radjabov keeps it solid, and b5. So that gains a bit more space. And basically what Carlsen is going to do much later on is play a5 to open up the a file. It's a good plan. So finally from Radjabov, bishop e6, he contests that beautiful bishop on c4. Bishop takes. Now black has a choice. I mean, normally I would say, why not recapture with the pawn, because it covers these squares. But white still has a very nice initiative, actually. And the problem with pawn takes is that in the long term, it does rather expose the king. And later on, that pawn on e6 could turn out to be a weakness. But rook takes. And, well, we'll see. Sometimes this rook can turn towards the king side, as we're about to see. c4. So Carlsen really in his element, actually, playing in a very strategic way. But on the other side of the board, Radjabov is developing counterplay. So obviously the knight looks very nice here. And if that's exchanged off, then black will recapture, and then that bishop flies. So it's just a very close contest at the moment. And now Radjabov really goes for it. g5. So he is seizing the initiative. At least on the king side anyway. But actually, although, of course, play becomes very, very sharp after this, I'm sure that Carlsen would have been very pleased to see that move. Because now he has a really clear plan. Watch what happens with that pawn g5 to g5. You see, that f5 square is weak. Imagine if that knight could be planted on f5. It's the kind of strategy that I've played in so many games myself. And once that knight gets there, life is good. Let's see how Carlsen does it. Well, first of all, he plays bishop to e3, which just clears the d2 square, and the knight bounces round. And, okay, how do we get to the f5 square? Via g3. Once the knight gets there, then black's counterplay is just dead. So, of course, Radja is going to prevent that. That obviously covers the g3 square. But there is a problem with playing the pawn to h4. That pawn is now weak. And actually at this moment, I was thinking, okay, Radjabov cannot withstand this. Black's position looks absolutely horrible. But incredibly, it's not so clear after bishop g7. Well, first of all, queen takes g4 doesn't work because of rook g6 and g2 is on prise. So that's the obvious one. Okay, so why not bishop takes and then queen takes g4? Surely that solves the problems. Well, this one isn't so clear after quite an incredible move. h3, and that just opens up white's king with this rook ready to swing across. If queen takes, then, well, rook h6 is possible, but, well, if nothing else, one could just swipe the rook in the corner. And, of course, pawn takes, rook g6 wins the queen. So that's a beautiful, disturbing move. So incredibly, after bishop g7, Radjabov is still in the game here. Carlsen invested about a minute and a half here because suddenly his easy plan was no longer there. But he found an excellent move, bishop c1. So this knight is going to get to f5 via a different route. Here it goes, knight e3. And actually, white is fine now. Still looks fantastic. If g3, you can exchange and just keep the position closed. And once the knight reaches f5, then everything turns white's way. So that's the position. Knight e3 just played, queen d7 and knight f5. And now, well, it looks tremendous for white. But still tricky with these pieces here. You know, black does have a certain amount of activity, but still, I would feel so comfortable with that knight on f5. Carlsen played a5. So he's starting to open up the a file. He doesn't have to just play on the king side. He can play a5 and exchange, put the rook on a6, puts pressure here, then potentially move the queen over later. It's really nice. So a5, well, that's basically the move that Carlsen has been aiming for ever since he advanced his pawn to b5, actually. King h7. Well, that might clear some lines for rooks to come over, but it's not easy now. Here, I'm really surprised that Carlsen didn't just play rook a6 to get the rook off this diagonal. That would make life simpler from a tactical point of view. Or indeed, just exchanging here and rook a6. Instead he played bishop e3. And now it got messy again. Pawn to d5. So this didn't happen, but if pawn takes, knight takes, and you can see pawn takes knight, queen takes knight. That's a bit messy. So it's suddenly complicated again. Carlsen exchanged here and then took on d5. So he sacrificed an exchange. The bishop takes the rook and queen takes. Still looks great for white. With that knight on f5. The queen on a pretty wonderful square. Controlling the long diagonal and the a file. In fact, the position isn't quite clear. Black can play h3 and that's still quite messy. But Radjabov went for rook e8. And after knight h4, well, white is definitely for choice here. And g3, you know, that is a really nice centre. And black's king looking exposed. f3, well, if the position ever opens, white's king could be in trouble. So that is a tricky move, and I think that really shows Radjabov's experience. He realizes that this is still a very difficult position to control for white. If it goes wrong, he can be in. It'll give him counterplay. So h3 is a very understandable move from Carlsen because it gives the king an escape square and starts the process of undermining that pawn on f3. Rook h5. And here Carlsen played knight f5. Now I should say, of course, you know, the players are starting to run short of time. It's a rapid play game. They only start with 15 minutes plus increments every time they make a move, 10 seconds. But still, this is really tough. But Carlsen makes a mistake, no doubt about it. If he'd played queen f6, that holds everything together. Keeps an eye on lots of interesting things. And white is definitely better there. I mean, maybe he was concerned about rook takes. But actually, after these exchanges, white is doing pretty well. Once that knight reaches f5, the queen and knight are a really beautiful attacking duo. But Carlsen played knight f5, and that allowed Radjabov back in the game after this exchange sack. And the position simplifies into a queen and pawn endgame. Now, of course, white is better here. But queen endgames are so tricky. There's always a chance of either a perpetual check or a pawn racing down the board. Past pawns just assume such potency in queen endgames. So at the moment the score is, well, Carlsen is one pawn up, but it's tricky. Now that pawn endgame is going to be a win for white. White is a pawn up there. But still, you know, you've got to calculate that. That's not so simple. But actually, well, this here and the king gets round here quickly. So queen b3, queen takes. I'm sure Carlsen was very relieved to have eliminated that dangerous pawn on f3. Queen takes pawn on b5, queen d5. And here is a really critical moment in the game. And I think this is where Radjabov made a mistake. He's still fine, I think, if he gives a check and just goes for it with the b pawn. Now, you've got to put up with some serious counterplay on this side of the board. But if that pawn advances, then you know it's just really hard to stop, basically. I mean, obviously white, worst case, will have a draw by perpetual. But can white win that? Very difficult. I mean, maybe there's a way if you play very precisely. But when you're running short of time, that is really tough. But instead of basically just abandoning his king and just playing with this kind of very straightforward strategy of advancing the pawn, which, it could go wrong, Radjabov retreated. But now it's very tricky. Carlsen has a clear plan here to expose Black's king, and once the king is exposed, then he might be able to pick pawns off. The best move is King G7, but Queen D6 definitely better for White. In any case, that would have been Black's best to play King G7, but he played Queen E6, and that is simply a miscalculation, or his intuition was incorrect. Anyway, Queen E6 is a mistake. Carlsen seized on this one. He's a pawn up, and this one is a win for White. I mean, maybe Radjabov had just thought this pawn was too quick for White's king, but I mean, obviously White is in time to bring the king across. In any case, White is winning. It's not too difficult. Basically, White can always break up those queenside pawns. Here, Radjabov resigned. Let me just show why exactly. I mean, obviously, the king can't take the pawn because this one goes through. So Black can only wait. And now King B3. King comes up. And now we can break up the pawns. And the king simply moves across to take the B pawn. So it's a very, very simple winning procedure. And at the start of this endgame, there really is nothing that Black can do here. It is completely lost. Now that win meant that Carlsen scraped in. So he finished with 8.5 out of 15. He was in 6th position. So he made it into the top 8. So let me just give you the scores. Let me tell you who went through. So at the top, Fabiano Caruana, really convincing, 10 out of 15. Anishgiri, 9 out of 15. Nakamura, 9 out of 15. Vacher Le Grave, 9 out of 15. Wesley So, 9 out of 15. 6th position, Carlsen with 8.5. Radjabov, also 8.5. And Nepo on 8. He came through on tiebreak. Ronin also had 8. So there we go. Those players will contest the knockout stage, but really dramatic last round, and Carlsen scraped by by the skin of his teeth. Absolutely. Right, thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed that.